And I promise you, the people of the 1st Congressional District of Illinois, that if I am elected to the Congress of the United States, I will represent your interests.
The year,
I consider it
1928. The place, Chicago's South Side. The man, Oscar DePriest, son of a former slave, more than 6 feet tall, white-haired, and as fair-skinned as a white man. He's a successful businessman, a well-known Republican politician, and he's campaigning to become the first black member of Congress in 27 years.
The political map had changed since 1901, when the last black man left Congress. Hundreds of thousands of black families had migrated from southern farms to northern cities. They were attracted by jobs and greater personal freedom. In the North, they could vote, and by 1928, Chicago's blacks were strong enough to elect Oscar DePriest to Congress. He was the first black congressman from the North and the first black congressman since 1901, when the tide of Reconstruction ebbed and turned against blacks in the South.
Some of Representative DePriest's fellow congressmen were not happy to see him come to Washington. DePriest's supporters were even afraid that his swearing-in might be blocked. But the Speaker of the House acted to make sure DePriest would take his seat without trouble. His action caught DePriest's enemies off guard. It also caught the nation's attention. Wrote one writer,
"To those who have never known the experience of insult because of the mere fact of race, and who do not know what it is like to be without rights as a means of protection, this may seem a trivial service. But it was not so judged by Mr. DePriest, the Negroes of Chicago, or the Negroes of America. For if Mr. DePriest had been insulted, every Negro in America would have felt the blow."
Southerners protested DePriest's election, but they couldn't ignore the fact that black Americans were beginning to feel their political strength.
In 1930, President Hoover nominated Judge John J. Parker of North Carolina to be a justice of the Supreme Court. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People discovered that Judge Parker in 1929 had said,
"The participation of the Negro in politics is a source of evil and danger to both races, and is not desired by wise men in either race."
Because the NAACP relied on the courts in seeking equality for blacks, it was afraid Judge Parker's views might influence his decisions. When the NAACP learned that the judge had not changed his opinion, it asked Hoover to withdraw the nomination. The president refused.
Mass protest meetings were held in Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Kansas City, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and St. Louis. The American Federation of Labor was convinced that labor's future would be endangered by the appointment, and it protested.
Senators were bombarded with letters, long-distance telephone calls, telegrams, petitions, and personal visits.
At the roll call, spurred on by the strong black reaction, the Senate refused to confirm Parker's nomination. Black Americans had fought and won.
Get aboard the Freedom Car, cast your vote for FDR, Cactus Jack and Franklin D, they're the ones for me.
America was by now deep in the Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic presidential candidate, convinced the country that he could do something about it. He was elected president in 1932.
Roosevelt did not start as the black man's president. In 1932, most blacks stayed loyal to the Republican Party and voted for Hoover. For blacks, the Democratic Party was still the party of Southern white supremacy, and only a quarter of black votes went to Roosevelt. For blacks, Roosevelt had another drawback. His health was poor, and if anything happened to him, Vice President John Nance Garner, a Texan, would move into the White House.
But Roosevelt was in office only a short time before black fears turned to praise. One of the first things Roosevelt did was to rely on a large group of black advisors who came to be called Roosevelt's Black Cabinet.
Presidents before Roosevelt had used blacks they trusted to take the black voters' pulse. But Roosevelt's Black Cabinet was different. Black cabinet members were officials of the government, working in important government offices. They were professional people, not for the most part politicians. They were highly trained specialists.
Roosevelt did more than appoint blacks to government offices. He began an active program designed to bring the country out of the Depression. It was called the New Deal, and it gave blacks a new hope for political and social progress.
The great purpose of Roosevelt's New Deal program was to find jobs, or create them if necessary, for the millions of jobless workers. There were training programs for laborers and programs to help writers, artists, and musicians.
Why did I join the CCC? Why did I join the CCC? Why did I join the CCC? This old hard labor is killing me.
The Civilian Conservation Corps was one of the New Deal labor programs. It was organized much like a military unit with its own officers. At first, blacks were not accepted in as great a proportion as whites, but this was corrected. One black worker recalled his days with the Corps.
During the first week, we did no work outside camp, but only hiked, drilled, and exercised. Since then, we have worked 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. Our bosses are local men, Southerners, but on the whole, I've found nothing to complain of. Our officers, who of course are white, are a captain, a first lieutenant, a doctor, and several sergeants. Our athletic director is colored, as is our vocational teacher. Discipline is maintained by imposing extra duty and fines on offenders. On the whole, I was gratified rather than disappointed with the CCC.
By 1938, Roosevelt's programs had helped more than 5 million blacks with jobs, relief, and housing. Roosevelt had so impressed blacks that black votes started shifting from the party of Lincoln to the party of Roosevelt. In the presidential campaign of 1936, more than half the black newspapers in the country supported Roosevelt.
Roosevelt's programs were important, but so was his attitude toward blacks. Roosevelt made it known that he was interested in black causes and black progress. He visited black institutions and often sent messages to black groups. His wife, Eleanor, was a close friend of Mrs. Mary McLeod Bethune, a member of the black cabinet. Mrs. Roosevelt invited the National Council of Negro Women to the White House. She visited black schools and federal projects.
None of these things sound radical today, but in the 1930s, the Roosevelt's actions aroused the nation. They helped bring dignity to the black people in the eyes of white people, even among many whites who did not agree with Roosevelt.
I see where Mrs. Roosevelt had Mrs. Bethune in to tea today. A fine First Lady, a real example of brotherhood and equality.
But not everyone cheered.
That man has done it again, parading around with those niggers for all the world to see. It's a disgrace, I tell you, a shameful disgrace.
Roosevelt's actions encouraged blacks to become involved in politics, democratic politics. In 1934, Arthur W. Mitchell, a black Chicago Democrat, unseated black Republican Oscar DePriest and became the first black Democrat to sit in Congress.
The courts also showed a new attitude toward the black man during Roosevelt's years in office. The NAACP, the legal voice of black Americans, scored victory after victory before the courts. In 1935, NAACP attorney Thurgood Marshall confronted the Maryland Court of Appeals. The result? The University of Maryland admitted a black graduate student for the first time.
A year later, the NAACP began a campaign on behalf of black teachers. The result? Both black and white teachers were paid equal salaries.
In 1938, the Supreme Court ruled that a state must provide equal educational facilities for blacks and whites.
NAACP lawyers won a lot of cases in the 1930s, but they didn't get rid of Jim Crow.
Jim Crow had again become a national issue in 1931 as a result of the most famous trial of the decade.
The freight train that left Chattanooga on March 25, 1931, was moving so slowly that anyone could jump on and off. A number of white and black boys had hopped on to ride from Tennessee to Alabama.
Don't push me, white boy. If you want by it, just tell me. I'll let you pass.
Nigga, I done asked you when I walk by. What you doing on this train anyhow?
Why? We got just as much right as you.
This is a white man's train, and I think we ought to put you off.
The outnumbered white boys dropped off the train and ran back to a nearby station. The man at the depot telephoned ahead, and when the train pulled into Paint Rock, Alabama, a posse was waiting.
Get them off the train, all of them. There's a couple down there in the boxcar.
Come on, you, move.
Bring them over here.
What's it all about?
Assault and attempt to murder. Get up on that truck.
The posse pulled 9 black youths, ages 13 to 20, off the train and took them to Scottsboro, Alabama. The posse also found 2 white girls.
Get in there, all y'all.
What they gonna do to us, Haywood?
I don't know, Eugene.
Y'all boys, look at these 2 girls. We found them on the train. Do you know them?
No, we never saw them before.
No, you're a damn liar. You attacked these gals.
The sheriff had to call the National Guard to chase the crowd home that night. All 9 boys were indicted for rape on March 31st, and the first trial was held just a week later. For the 3 days of the trials, Scottsboro was like a carnival as 10,000 people jammed the town of 1,000 residents. 9 times a jury filed out of the courtroom, and 9 times it filed back, once for each of the 9 black youths.
Have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor. We, the jurymen, find the defendant guilty as charged and fix his punishment as death.
Nine trials, 9 convictions, calling for death. 8 death sentences. Only Roy Wright escaped the death sentence, and only because he was 13 years old. The judge sentenced him to life in prison.
The Scottsboro affair became an international scandal. Both of the girls on the train were of weak character and uncooperative. Only one girl would testify against the boys, and her testimony was so contradictory it was worthless. Within hours after the judge sentenced the boys, volunteer defense lawyers wired the judge and the governor demanding a stay of execution, an opportunity to investigate, and a new trial.
Before the end of the decade, mass demonstrations for the Scottsboro boys were held in Harlem, France, England, and 26 other countries. The case twice came before the Supreme Court of the United States, and twice established vital principles of law.
In the first case, the court overturned the convictions on the ground that the right to counsel had been denied. The boys had had only token legal help at their trial.
In the second case, the court set aside the convictions because blacks had been systematically excluded from the juries.
Despite world opinion and legal reversals, Alabama tried the boys over and over until the conviction stood. In 1937, after 6 years in prison, 4 of the men, including little Roy Wright, were freed. In 1944, 2 more were paroled. And in 1946, 1 other was paroled. In 1958, Haywood Patterson escaped, leaving only 1 of the original 9 behind bars.
The Scottsboro case that shocked the world in the 1930s showed the worst side of American racism. But America had no monopoly on racism. In Germany, Adolf Hitler was building a program of racism and extermination that would become his government's official policy. Hitler's Nazi Party spouted the doctrine of white supremacy, a special supremacy that often meant death to the Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, and other minorities inside Germany's borders, and later throughout Europe.
And while the Nazis were shouting the superiority of the blonde, blue-eyed master race, a black American track star named Jesse Owens pulled the rug from under them on their home ground. The event, the 1936 Olympics, the place, Berlin.
Ladies and gentlemen, another world record was set today by America's own Jesse Owens. In the capital city of the so-called master race, the son of an Alabama sharecropper won his 4th gold medal and set Adolf Hitler back on his heels. In the past few days, Owens has tied the world record for the 100-meter dash, set a new world record for the broad jump, set a new record for the 200-meter dash, and led to victory the U.S. 400-meter relay team. Yes, sir, a great day in Olympic history. I guess you could say that Jesse Owens lectured Hitler with his feet.
War clouds gathered in Europe as Hitler prepared to expand Germany's frontiers. And in 1938, another black American athlete KO'd German boasts of white supremacy. This time, the battleground was the boxing ring. The year, 1938. The fighters, Max Smaling and Joe Louis.
Here we go, boxing fans. Both fighters meet in the center of the ring and begin to size each other up. There's a right by Schmeling that misses. Louis counters with a combination that catches Schmeling off guard. Another right by Schmeling slides past the champion's jaw, and a left also misses. Louis keeps moving in on the challenger, jabbing him with lefts. There's a right by Louis that sends Schmeling reeling back against the ropes. He recovers, and the two are at the center of the ring again. Oh, Louis opens with a barrage of punches that Schmeling can't defend against. A right to the head, left to the midsection. A vicious right knocks Schmeling off his feet. He can't get up. 4, 5. Schmeling's not getting up. 8, 9. Joe Louis knocks out Schmeling in the first round. What a fight! What a fight! People are going wild.
That night in Harlem, thousands of people thronged the streets, shouting, clapping, laughing, and crying. Children who should have been in bed were on the streets pounding dishpans and yelling. The Pittsburgh Courier explained the excitement.
Joe Louis had lifted an entire race out of the slough of inferiority and given them a sense of self-importance.
War threats pushed sports events to the back of the newspapers. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. War was coming. It was only a matter of time before America would join the battle.
Black Americans knew that they would be called on to fight thousands of miles from home. Many were bitter. By now, they had lost faith in Roosevelt and the promises of the New Deal. Racism and discrimination had not disappeared from government programs, and many blacks began to speak of the dirty deal.
As the pressures of the Depression lifted, blacks looked for jobs in private industry. They learned that the small gains made under the New Deal were only temporary. Private industry kept out most black workers, and democracy seemed a long way off at home as the nation prepared to defend it abroad. As one black man said in a letter to the editor of the Raleigh News and Observer,
"The Negro races of the earth are very suspicious of the white man's good intentions. This is very likely to be the last war that the white man will be able to lead humanity to wage for plausible platitudes."
World War II took black American men and again sent them around the world, often to fight and die. But often it took them to meet white men and women in other countries and learn, sometimes to their surprise, that being black was not always a barrier, not always an important difference in the eyes of white people. They learned, and many of the white soldiers who fought beside them learned that men who could die together could live together as friends and equals. This knowledge brought a new measure of strength and hope to black soldiers who came home from the war. Their confidence was passed along to black communities everywhere in the North and South. In this confidence were the seeds for the civil rights reform that was slowly coming to the United States.